Hey, folks, welcome to the Battles of the First World War podcast. So, joining me today is David Brady, former park ranger at Sergeant Alvin York State Park in Tennessee. David and I connected a couple of years ago when he invited me on the Pall Mall Doughboys podcast, and we talked about the Meuse-Argonne during that session. And for David and all other Tennessee residents, I've been pronouncing that Pall Mall, like the cigarette brand, for like the last 40 something years. So I do apologize. No offense meant. Pall Mall is the place in Tennessee. Following up on the recent talk with Tennessee historian Pat Gang, David joins us today to dive a little deeper into the AEF's 30th Old Hickory Division and its 119th Infantry Regiment, in which David's great-grandfather served and saw action. At the recent Great War Expo at York State Park, David came in dressed as a doughboy with accurate gear, which by itself was awesome. However, he also brought the letters his great-grandfather wrote home from the front, and that was truly special. My hope is that we get to hear some of these letters here today. So, David, welcome, and thanks for coming on the show, man.
Sure. Thanks for having me. I'm been excited to do this.
Awesome. So, if you would, tell us a little bit more about yourself, and then, like, when did your interest in the Great War begin? And are you, like, specifically like a Great War enthusiast, or does your history interests do they span out further?
Yes. So, like you said, I was park ranger over at Sergeant Alvin York State Historic Park, and before that, I was actually a park ranger over at Frozen Head State Park here in Tennessee in Morgan County. But I was with parks for altogether it was close to 10 years with seasonal work and then full time work, and then yeah, live here in historic Oak Ridge, which kind of is a cool place to live if you're into history and all that. It's really neat. It was also really neat just to watch the Oppenheimer movie here in Tinseltown, the Tinseltown theater. So that was kind of a neat kind of a thing. Anyways, that's so talking about the history, I guess you could say, of the what I like. It kind of spans a great deal. Of course, I enjoy studying World War II history, a little bit of Civil War. I'm really getting into the early American Continental Army and stuff like that.
Okay.
So I don't really have necessarily one that I really focus on, except for World War One history. Just in the past few years, especially working at Alvin C. York. So that's really where my focus has been a lot, especially with these letters. And getting into the next part, that was really kind of what started spurred me on to start studying and delving deeper into World War One history. Of course, I was aware. I mean, I studied it in my free time, and just like all of us enthusiasts do. And
Sure.
But let's see. I guess that was in about 2016, 2015 or so. I was given my great grandfather's letters that he wrote, like you were talking about, that he wrote while he was over in France and on the front lines, which I have all of his letters. I think it's a total of about 27 or so, excuse me, from the time that he leaves Camp Severe all the way to when he comes back later on in early 1919. So reading those was really fascinating and just really drew me in even more because I like genealogy and I like just history. So being able to merge those together and see something that one of my relatives went through, it really brought it to life more. And then something else that also really spurred it on for me was when the movie They Shall Not Grow Old came out.
Yes.
The one by Peter Jackson. That one to me, it kind of changed the way that I saw World War One because we're used to seeing it the jittery, jumpy, sped up footage, archival footage, but that really brought it even into more life for me and drew me in even more because I really wanted to kind of focus on my great grandfather and his experience, and then also just the soldier's experience of, because we always hear about the big battles, and that's what I really like about your podcast in general is like you do that zoom down into the single soldier every now and again and really give the whole overview. So I was listening to your podcast there, still do. And so that was just kind of the culmination of it. And then, especially getting to work at Sergeant York, I was able to, as you said, dress out in the kit. And what I was always telling people is this: if this even just gives me like a tiny inkling of a small percentage of what they went through or what it was like for them to do all these amazing things that they did, it just makes me appreciate it that much more. So that really kind of cemented it for me and really brought it home a little bit more, just to be able to experience a little bit of what he did. So that's kind of where my World War I history sort of focuses in on, is really the 119th specifically, but the 30th in general. So
Awesome. All right. So we got. I think we just went into the second question here. What area of World War One history really captures your interest? All right. So let's dig into that 119th Infantry Regiment. So can you talk about, and we don't have to go too deep here, but like its formation, where its men came from, and the commanders, and where it did some of its training. Now I know the 30th Division, as Mr. Pat Gang was telling us just a few days ago. One regiment was from Tennessee, another from South Carolina, and two from North Carolina, if I'm correct.
Mhm.
So the
It
one
was
nine,
that kind of tri-state area, I guess you could say.
yeah. All right. So where was the 119th primarily? Where did the men primarily come from in the beginning, anyways?
So they were mostly from, like you said, they were from Tennessee, North Carolina, and South Carolina. A lot of them were from Tennessee originally when they were kind of brought in, because they were kind of transfigured from the 2nd North Carolina Infantry,
Okay.
which was down on the Mexican border in about June of 1916.
Hmm.
And instead of them, they were down there for about 6 months. And instead of mustering out, they actually just kind of rolled over into Camp Sevier in Greenville, South Carolina,
Oh,
and just kind of went straight into the formation of the 119th and the 30th as a whole. So let's see, they got a lot of people from the 59th Depot Brigade at Camp
okay.
Sevier. And it's funny, in my great grandfather's letters, I'll try not to reference them too much, but
No,
um,
no worries.
he has one of his first letters is actually addressed from the 59th Depot Brigade, and then the next letter that he writes is 119th Infantry. So it was kind of neat to see him go from that, the depot into an actual unit.
Yep.
But it took most of those men. It was about, let's see, I can't remember the numbers. I think I've got them here. So after that, the Second Carolina was rolled in. There was later about 800 men from North Carolina that were transferred from Camp Jackson, South Carolina,
Okay.
and then there was about 700 men from Camp Dodge and Camp Gordon that were also assigned. So in total, whenever they were all kind of finally rolled in all together, there was about 1,800 men from North Carolina, 900 men from Tennessee, about 700 men from Illinois, Indiana, Iowa, Kentucky, Minnesota, Ohio, and Wisconsin. So while there were men from other places across the state, mostly due to just them being in service beforehand,
Hmm.
the majority of them were from North Carolina, and then Tennessee was kind of second with the 900. And so that was kind of the main body, was from North Carolina and Tennessee, and then kind of a smattering of people from all around.
Sure.
But their main commander throughout pretty much, he transferred, let's see, I think it was while they were in training at Camp Sevier, was Colonel, what's his name, John Metz, or Meets. Yeah, Colonel John Van Meets, or Metts, however you would pronounce that. And he was kind of their mainstay colonel through pretty much the entire war. But he came from a regimental staff, and he brought a bunch of other guys over. And So that was kind of their formation, and then their training was pretty much all, at least in the States, was at Camp Sevier, which is in South Carolina.
Hmm.
And it was funny when they first got there to Camp Sevier, it was all forested and they had to spend the first couple of months. I don't know if Pat talked about that, but
He did.
yeah, clearing the land. So that in and of itself would be a good way to like kick your boot camp into gear. You know, it's like, all right, here you're at your spot. Let's literally make your barracks, clear off all these things, and
Yeah,
so that was a good way to kick it off, I guess.
I think so. Yeah, like if you want to sleep tonight, you need to go ahead and start building your barracks there, guys.
Yeah.
Like so.
Do you want a fire? And you better go get to chopping.
Exactly. Yeah, yeah. Welcome to the army, boys.
Yeah, exactly. It's not gonna gets easier from here, I guess.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that was where they did all their training, and I'm not sure what all Pat went into, but of course it was just your basic boot camp. But
Mhm.
one thing that was kind of true, I mean, across all of the United States Army's training that we're having to train so many men at once was, instead of doing, these gradual things where they worked up, into each thing, they were having to do a lot of those trainings basically at the same time and condense it down and still get all that training, but it was more kind of condensed. So
Mhm.
that was a big thing. And then I don't know if he talked about Spanish flu that broke out in the camp near before. It was a few months before they shipped out, actually.
I don't think we
But
touched on that too much.
well, it's just to say that I mean, they had a lot of hardships just while they were in basic training.
Right.
But they finally, let's see. So you want me to go ahead and move into the when they went to France and when they deployed
Yeah.
and when they shipped out and everything?
Yeah. When they deploy overseas.
Yeah. So they left. Let's see. It was the about mid-May. They left Camp Sevier and then they moved, or they basically were just transported to Hoboken. It was Camp Merritt. They're near Hoboken, New Jersey, which was where
Okay.
they were going to be embarking onto their ships to take them across. And the three ships that took them across were the Scania, the Haverford, and the Leomaden.
Okay.
Leomaden. And they left on May 11th, and they sailed up to Nova Scotia, and then from there they took the big long trip across, and they arrived in Liverpool on May 27th, and it was a relatively uneventful journey across. There was one or two sightings of a German U-boat, but the destroyers that were there with them kind of chased them off.
Okay.
And other than that, it was just they had some rough seas, but that was about it. But then once they get into Liverpool, of course, they go march on across and were transported over to Dover. And then they finally arrived in a place near Calais in May 29th.
Okay.
And then so that was when they kind of first touched down over in France, was May 29th. And then they go about 10 miles southeast to a place called, and you'll have to either correct me or pardon me for my pronunciation of some of these names. I've
No
never heard them
worries.
pronounced out loud, so I think it's the Andrique, France, which was just a little bit outside of Calais, like we were talking about.
Okay.
And then that's when they really started doing their secondary training with the British. So as Pat talked about, and we kind of talked about a little bit, the 30th and the 27th were unique in the fact that they were quote unquote part of and handed over to the British to be under their command. While they still were American units, they were just kind of handed over. It was part of a big, the big long debate that they had to try and get all the men over, but we didn't have the shipping, so they had to work out something with
Right.
the British. But that's a whole another podcast. But they get over there and they start training with them, and they were training with some of, especially the 119th. They did a lot of their training with a cadre of instructors from the 9th Black Watch and the 9th and 10th Gordon Highlanders, and they
Okay.
were under the command of Brigadier General N.S. Hubbard. So that was kind of their group that did a lot of their training. And but it was a lot of training like it was back over in the States, a lot of training packed in to a dense amount of time. And it was supposed to be done in originally 3 phases. There was A, B, and C phase,
Hmm.
and this first part was A phase, of course, and they just kind of did a little bit more in depth study of especially the trench warfare, special warfare. They worked with grenades. They especially had to acquaint themselves with the new rifles that they were using.
Right.
So we traded in our American rifles for the British SMLE, this small magazine Lee Enfield,
Hmm.
and I've seen a couple of pictures that I really like of it's some men from the 30th and they're at the depot getting their new supplies, and it's about 4 or 5 of them standing around and they're holding the SMLEs and they're all looking at each other like, is this really what we're using? Like, what is this? Because they're used to something else.
Right. Springfield.
But other than that, their equipment was relatively the same, except for the rations, which that's a funny story where they were receiving British rations
Hmm.
and they were receiving a lot of complaints, like the higher ups, because the portions that were in the British portions were a lot smaller than what the Americans were used to. And it also came with tea, which, a lot of Americans were like, okay, what's this? So they had to do a little bit of tweaking to their rations and things that they were receiving, and they replaced it with coffee and gave them a little bit more meat because they actually did some studies just of the difference between the British soldier and the American soldier at the time, and the
Hmm.
American soldier, which it's stated in a lot of different people's memoirs and writings about them. They talk about how big the Americans were, and not just like big and hefty and fat,
And
just
they
how
just
yeah they were just
tall.
stocky, yeah,
Yeah.
big old dudes. Because especially these, I mean, they were the way we would think about it is good old country boys. I mean, they were country strong, and they were just big boys.
Right. Right.
And but that was another thing that was also stated a lot by the British were they were always impressed by their energy and motivation and their willingness to do stuff, which I think is kind of a cool way to see it. That these a lot of the British had a lot of preconceived notions and were thinking,
Sure.
oh, all these Americans are going to come over and they're not going to be worth a lick, and they're not going to be able to do anything. But then they come over and they really, kind of show them like, hey, we're 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 here to work. Like let's do
Yeah.
this, and they're really take a lot of the British by surprise and change a lot of sentiments, especially in the higher ups. There's a lot of writings of executive officers and uh, officers in the higher ups that are just continually surprised and impressed by the Americans. So
That's cool.
I always
That's
like to think
cool.
about that.
Yeah, that's cool to know. And for listeners, a quick note regarding food. So I have read, and I read this from a reputable source, that on average, the American doughboy during his experience in the AEF would gain an average of 12 pounds. So you think at the time many of these guys came from poor, hard scrabble lives, and I believe the army provided steady meals, steady calorie rich meals. So I think that just goes to show our doughboys can eat, and they had good stomachs, and so to have be put almost on half rations, like, yeah, that's definitely gonna cause a problem for them. And I know there was an argument too that they had with the British about cheese, that they were
Yes.
like, dude, cheese is like not a part of the meal. It's like a side dish, and it was
Mhm.
something like that, and it was a big to do, and I'm not sure if it ever got worked out.
Yeah, it was. It's interesting to read into that just because of you don't think about it being the differences in rations and what the men are eating, but like it was like you said, it was a big to do. And the funny thing is the speed at which that was corrected is one of the few things I think within the organization of the army and a lot of places. If your men are not happy, especially with something that they have to deal with every day, as in their food,
Right.
they're you're gonna get a lot of angry men very quickly. So the
Hmm.
speed at which they rectified that to me, I think is impressive, but also says a lot. Like, let's get these guys their food. Like, we don't want them, hangry out here. So let's
Right.
let's get
Yeah.
this fixed.
Hangry with rifles. Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
in a foreign country, no less.
Gotcha. Gotcha. All right. So 119th gets in there. It continues its training in France. Now, I believe the final part of the training, I don't know if it's part of the ABC schedule, but I know that it was, I believe it was considered part training, but it's kind of like this is your live fire exercise. Was when a unit was deemed ready, the British or the French trainers would say, "All right, you're going live. You're going into the front line. We'll be with you, but this is the real deal now, guys." Where did the 119th first do that service?
Yes, thank you for getting me back on track. So they did that. Let's see. So that would have been technically phase B, like you were saying. So that would have
Oh,
been
phase
the
B. Okay.
yeah,
Oh,
that
wow.
was at least for the 119th, and they did that in a place near. Let me see if I can get this correct. Popperinhinge. I don't know if I'm saying that. Is that
I
correct?
think I think of it as Popperinga, but I may be
Okay,
wrong too. But
Popperinga. Okay, we'll go with
yes.
that. That sounds better. So they were moved out there, and this, like you said, this was part of their phase B,
Hmm.
where when they first moved out. So technically, this was deemed a quote unquote quiet part of what was actually the front lines, but it was
Right.
kind of in a place that was not as active. So what they did was they would go out, and at first, I believe it was for the first, it was either 3 to 7 days, so 3 days to a week or so. Each American was stationed or had a British soldier with them. So it was basically one for one. So they did that for about a week, and then after that, they sort of started, like you were saying, sort of phasing them out.
Hmm.
And what they did was they concentrated their companies together, but so they would have an American company, and then on either side they would have a British company. So you could kind of think it alternating across the
Sure.
line. So that
Makes
way
sense.
they were still in support, and if they had questions, they could easily go over and ask, or send word however they needed to get that information. But then after that, they were actually moved out. The whole 119th, the regiment was moved off to a portion of the line that was all American held. So they did
Okay.
that with all of the regiments. So they moved them out, and then eventually there was a whole section of the line that was being held by the Americans, and that was they relieved I think it was the 35th British Division
Okay.
when they went in to do that section of the line, and that was, let me see if I can remember where that was exactly. I think it was still over there near the Popperinga, like you said.
Popperinga.
It was in that area where they were eventually phased out, and then after that, like you were saying, they were sort of deemed worthy. And one thing to note with the section that they were on, I said quote unquote it was a quiet part of the line. There was actually a lot of artillery fire that was going back and forth in that one section due to some supposed. They received word of some possible attacks that the Germans were coming,
Okay.
so the Germans, sent their artillery over, and in response, the British did that, and they kind of had a little bit more exchange than they were expecting. So there were actually a few casualties during that time on the line, but it wasn't because of any direct engagement. But after that, they were finally moved. Excuse me, for their actual, I guess you could say, real debut on the line would have been August 15th. And this is when they were moved even further east into Ypres. Is that how you pronounce it?
Yes. Yep. Ypres. You got it.
Yeah. So they moved just south of Ypres, and it was called the Canal Sector. And
Okay.
there were several canals there. And this offensive, what they were getting ready for, was known as the Ypres, and then I think it's the Lys, Lys,
Lease. Yep.
Lys.
Yep.
So the Ypres Lys offensive was kind of this section where it was their send off into the Great War itself, I guess you could say.
Okay.
And they were there. Oh, and one other thing I meant to note in their training while they were
Yes.
back a little bit further back, on August 6th, they were actually the 119th specifically was visited by three pretty big visitors. So one of them being Hague. Hague came.
Really?
Uh, the King of England came and stopped by, and then I think it was later that day or the next day. Um, Blackjack Pershing came by and inspected them because, oddly enough, the 119th received many commendations throughout its time, like while it was in training, but then also in combat and then out of combat afterwards while they were kind of waiting to disembark. They received numerous commendations and recognition for their just to the letter following things and keeping everything clean in camp. They won an award for basically the best the best kept regiment, and that's why they
Really?
were visited. And it's funny in one of the letters of my great grandfather's, he actually writes, and he's sort of like he's definitely not impressed by it because it's only like a letter or like a line or two, and he says something about they're making us go to pass and review. I think General Pershing is stopping by or something like that. And like that's all he says. It's not like, oh, he's coming to see us and this. He's just like, it's just another parade we got to do or whatever.
Because
So
it probably meant a lot of work, a lot of spit and polish work for him.
yes,
More
yes, making
like
sure your hospital corners on your bed and everything was to the
yep.
letter, which good for them. But yeah, he probably just thought it's just like, ugh, we just gotta one
Yeah.
more thing we got to keep on top of. But I thought that was kind of an interesting note, especially for the 119th. But anyway, so they went out onto the line, and this is where they kind of see their first action while they're
Okay.
over there, and it wasn't necessarily in the form of any big attacks or anything like that.
Hmm.
Mostly what they were doing were different patrols that they were sent out on, because they were in the vicinity of a hill that was called Kimmel Hill, and it
Camel Hill. Yep.
was you know it's something that I realized we were talking about before the podcast. Whenever I went recently over to France, and we were driving through, is I never really realized how flat it is over there. And when they talk about this hill had a commanding view, and it was only a 15 or 30-meter high hill. I'm just like, I mean, that's nothing here back in Tennessee. But when you get over there, it's like, oh no, you can see everything because it's so flat and farmland, and just how it did make a difference. So they were under the eyes of this Mount Kimmel, and they were taking a lot of artillery fire, and they were being sent out to kind of probe the enemy and see if they could capture anybody to get intel. That was their main objective. And one successful patrol that the 119th in particular had, they went out, and it was kind of a bigger patrol that was coordinated with a couple of the other regiments around. But they did capture a couple of Germans, and they were able to deduce that the enemy was actually pulling out of the area, and it was more of just kind of a rear guard, or they were just kind of not really fighting super hard, but just still putting up enough to kind of show that they were there.
Yeah.
Um,
Keep up appearances.
yes, exactly. And there was, let me read a quote from one of the officers when they were there. They captured one person while they were on these patrols, and the response that he writes for when he sends it on up to HQ for the report. Let's see. Here it says, this was from a Major Bodie, who sent this note back to HQ and says, "Here's a man captured near post number 5. He is either on leave or AWOL. In either case, he picked a damn bad place to spend it." So, just kind of going to show that they weren't really doing anything major defense wise. So, after they have that first kind of foray, gives them a good little boost of like we got our first taste. And then after that, they're moved back off the line to do a little bit more supplemental training, and they're moved down a little bit further south to get ready for kind of other their biggest action that they're really known for was when they attacked the Hindenburg line, which that was kind of their big thing, and that's what the 30th was kind of known for. And the 119th in particular, they were kind of on the spearhead of that attack for breaking the Hindenburg line.
So this is um, 119th and the 30th Division. They get moved down from the Ypres area down to the area of the Somme. And by the Somme, it's close to the British battlefield from 1916, but it's moved past it now. And for our listeners, it's so as we were talking about it this past Saturday with Pat Gang, it was in the area of Saint-Quentin, and so it's the old battlefield. If you can picture the old Somme battlefield of the British, if you look to I think it's the northeast, kind of moving up there. This is around the villages of Bonny and Riqueval, where the famous British picture of all the troops by the bridge was taken, and the Bellecourt Tunnel and everything. So it's more in that area. Thanks, David. I just want to paint a picture here for the listeners.
No, yeah, thank you. That's something I forget to do, is to set the scene and kind of tell where they were. But yeah, you say the Bellecourt Tunnel, that was where the 119th in particular went overland. They were one of the few regiments that actually went across that expanse of, I think it was 6 kilometers of where the tunnel went underland. Okay. And then there was that little bit of the land that covered the tunnel itself. Mm-hmm. That was where the main direction of the 30th forces were at. So it was kind of sort of the spear tip across that piece. And the 119th in particular was on the far left of that, which in and of itself kind of had a little bit of trouble, because I don't know if Pat really went into it. When they were setting up to, set the tape for the jump off time of September 28th, or when the actual attack went across the Hindenburg line, they were having some trouble with a small village or city that was up on a small hill just a little bit north of there. And it took, I think it was the 118th Infantry that really took a beating, especially the British before them, really took a beating from there, because they had the high ground and they had to root them out, because they needed to clear that out so they could straighten up their line to then get ready to push across. So they did capture most of it, but they still received a lot of other fire from that area. But so on September 28th is when they started. It was 5:50 in the morning, and that was when jump off time was. It was very foggy. Of course, there was the artillery barrages that went out ahead of it. They said that it was so foggy that you had trouble seeing, 3 or 4 men down the line. But in one hand, that was kind of bad for them, but on the other hand, it was kind of good. It offered them a little bit of cover, at least for a little bit. But it was also said about this one stretch there across the canal where it was covered, that it was some of the most heavily fortified and wired off places, because it was one of the few overland areas that you could go across the canal and not have to go down across the canal and then back up.
Right. So
they really packed it in there. And this was a noteworthy place of where tanks were used as well. So that the 119th and the 30th, they all got to train with the tanks for a little bit before this. So that was kind of interesting. They do end up jumping off and going across, and they capture they broke the line itself and actually started going across the 119th in particular around 7:30 a.m., which, I mean, that's not bad. That's right around 2 hours or so. And that's, for as heavily fortified as it was, I feel that that's pretty impressive. But they had a lot to bring to bear on this one area, and it was, they had a lot of training by then, and they had a lot of experience that they had gained from training with the men that had been over here fighting already. So I feel like that did help kind of pave the way, so to speak, for them to be able to, and not just them, all the armies across. So they break across, and then they kind of hold their positions. And then I think it was about 3 p.m. in the afternoon, after they've secured all their areas, the 5th Australian Division comes in and kind of relieves them, and then they kind of start leapfrogging up.
Okay.
But that was really their biggest thing that they're really known for, and their biggest engagement. After they did that, they still fought. Let's see, they fought from October 19th, or they fought to October 19th from September 28th.
Oh,
Which
okay. 3 weeks.
really, yeah, it was, and really it was a little bit before that, because they still had to fight and get up to that position when they jumped off. So I mean, it was right around a month. It was a little over 3 weeks or so, but they pushed west until October 19th, until they got to the Sombray Canal, which was a little bit
Okay.
further east,
Mhm.
and that was when they got pulled off the line, because they had been fighting for so long, and they had a lot of smaller, big engagements, I guess you could
Sure.
say, throughout that, especially like the LaSalle River. That was kind of their last really big, harsh push that they had, but they had a lot of other smaller engagements along the way, just fighting their way through. But just as a little note, from the time that they started the push there at the end of September all the way up to October 19th, the casualty list was, and this is just for the um, the 119th, yes. So it was 44 officers and 1,021 enlisted men that were killed.
Wow.
There were 113 officers wounded, and just under 5,000 enlisted men wounded. And then they had 2 missing officers and 196 missing enlisted men. And then there were 3 officers and 24 enlisted men that were captured. So in total casualty, when you take all of those all together, it was 162 officers and 6,240 enlisted men that were total casualties. But we kind of broke it down there, and I mean that speaks volumes as to what they, and just like everyone else that were fighting their way through this big, because this was the big 3 kind of section push
Right.
that was coordinated. So I mean, you just take that and multiply that across all of them, and some places saw a lot harder fighting, and so it just kind of puts into perspective just those 3 weeks of fighting, what it took on them, and the toll that it took and extracted on them as they pushed their way west.
Yeah. Those are really heavy casualties, because folks, if you think an American division, the square division, as we discussed several times here, 4 infantry regiments in an American division, that's about 3,000 men for each regiment. So you're talking about 13,000 rifles in an American division. So you hear David's figures here of like 6,300 casualties. That's about half of those guys are gone. I mean, that's enough to make that division combat ineffective,
Yeah, and
they still
they
keep going.
yeah, and they effectively were. By the end of that, they were, I guess you could say, running on a shoestring budget, more or less, of
Mm-hmm.
men and equipment, and it was a lot of hard fighting. And the like you said, just the thing that also kind of makes you really realize is, you spoke about it in your presentation at the World War One Expo, was that was the whole reason that they made these divisions, the square divisions, and so large, was for this purpose of starting a big advance and just keep on pushing, be able to absorb those casualties, and still be able to push on and fight. So I think that's kind of a good illustration of what he's talking about with the divisional casualties that were taken here, but how they were still able to fight. So it's kind of a heavy way to think about it, but it showed that their thinking was correct and why they made those divisions so large. It
Yeah.
was for this reason.
Yeah. Yeah. So the model kind of worked in this case. The
Mhm.
30th was able to keep pushing through. And I know that Pershing purposely held back any reinforcements from the 27th and the 30th Division who were serving with the Brits in that area, because any American replacements that he could get, he was funneling them into the Meuse-Argonne, which was, as we know, that was also chewing up every unit that was getting in there. So, man, in the midst of all this, David, is your great grandfather. Wow. And so now we're going from division to regiment, down to one man who was there. So can you tell us about your great grandfather and a few of his experiences?
Sure. So I don't know a ton about him, the man himself,
Mm-hmm.
just because we just don't have much written or about him that we know.
Sure.
Um, but my dad would tell me of when he was with his grandmother, so it would have been his wife. His name was Robert Lee Brady, and he talks about hearing little bits and pieces about him from her, but that was so long ago, and he
Mm-hmm.
doesn't really have much of it. But he was from kind of a similar sort of area as Sergeant York from
Okay.
Pall Mall. He was from a little place in Overton County near Livingston. That's where he actually enlisted, which is Livingston is where I'm from originally.
Okay.
And very just small rural town. I mean, especially back then, it was just very small, not much to write about. If it tells you anything, Hillham, which is where his future wife that he's writing to, she's from, it's about, I don't know, 20, 30 minutes north of Livingston. And that's now by car. So back then it would have been even more.
Oh,
On
wow.
his letters, the only thing that he addresses it to is he puts her name, because now we have to put name, city, postcode, all this other stuff. All he wrote was her name and then Hillham, Route 1. And like that was all he put, and it got to her never failed, because I mean there was probably just a handful of people living out there anyways.
Right, right.
So
And the guy delivering the mail is gonna know, like, oh, of course
oh
I
yeah, he knows. Yeah, he's like, it's yeah, I know
yeah,
who that is. So
yeah.
everybody, and honestly, they were probably all related somehow or another, distant cousins or something like that. So everybody knew everybody. But so it was kind of a very, very rural area that he came from. He was actually 27 and a half years old when he enlisted.
Okay.
And he enlisted with his brother, which I don't think it's in this letter, but no, I don't. It's in a different letter. He talks about his brother because he and his brother were in the same squad from from Camp Severe all the way through when he was injured at the battle, the St. Quentin Canal, when they were attacking the Hindenburg line.
Wow.
So
Okay.
that's just kind of interesting to me that they just let brothers stay together, through the
And they
through the
they
war.
as far as they got along and
Yeah, in one of his letters, it's the one before this one, where he writes about seeing him. He knew that he was injured by a machine gun fire on the initial assault, and he writes about, oh, I hated to see it so much, and I was lucky to find out later that he was okay. He was just wounded, but if I would have lost him, it would have been hard,
oh wow.
because he was the closest friend that I've had all the way since we left the States, pretty much. So like they got along, and especially in those circumstances, I think they probably held on to even more so, just
Sure.
because of being far away from home and doing and seeing the things that were happening. So, um, but yeah, so they both actually made it through the war, which very crazy odds to think about, but
Right. Right.
they were able to make it through. But yeah, he was just kind of a farmer, no other real special training. I mean, he had just basic education, but just kind of the war came and he went and signed up, and
Yeah.
went and did his part.
Grew up hunting and everything. So probably had some skill with the rifle already.
Yeah, he probably, again, very kind of parallels with Sergeant York.
Yep.
Not necessarily being, crack shot or anything, but
Sure.
he was a farmer. He grew up out in the sticks, so he was used to, having a rifle and things. So it probably was not a shock to him to hold a rifle and use it, as opposed to, a lot of people, men that were coming in that had never even touched a rifle.
Right.
So I
Right.
guess that
And
he at least had that going for him.
yeah, and also I would think, you know, probably grew up with a hard life and was
Mhm.
no stranger to hard work. So kind of going into that regimented military life, I mean, it might be something, all the rules might be something he might not like, but it's like, okay, my body knows what hard work is. So I can do this, like, or at least I know it, like, wow,
Yeah, and
wow, man.
from some of the letters, like especially his earlier letters, he never really complains necessarily about, the rules and stuff like that.
Hmm.
I think, like you're saying, to him it was just, it's just work. It's hard work, but I mean, he's getting, like we were talking about earlier too, he's getting fed, he's got a place to stay, he's getting, clothing given to him.
Right.
So I mean, I think like a lot of other people, he didn't necessarily have a problem with it. The biggest problem, I think, or that I know that he suffered from, was just homesickness and missing who he's writing to, which her name
Yeah.
was Arna, and you'll hear it in one of these letters, but he repeats it over and over and over. He just says, he'll ask, "How are you doing? Okay, I hope. I'm just as lonesome as can be," and that's bad. And just talks about how he just misses being home and just misses her. But I think that was really all that was. It was just he missed being
Y-
at home
Yeah.
more than anything, which is understandable.
Yeah, totally. So he makes it. He and his brother, they both make it through the war, and they probably at different points, I imagine, because the brother was wounded. They get demobilized, and then when does your great grandfather come home?
So he comes back. I think it's. I think he gets on the ship and comes back at the 1st of April in 1919,
Okay.
and then is finally, mustered out or discharged or whatever. I think it's about the middle of April or so of that year. And like you're saying, his brother, oddly enough, he ended up staying until the December of 1919 due to his, his convalescence and his wounds and stuff like that, which is crazy to me. I mean, I know he had to get better and stuff like that, but like, I feel like he could get to a certain point and then he would be okay on the ship, like going
Sure.
back and get to stay in the States. But
Yeah.
he had to stay on that much longer. But it was about April of when he got to come back home. My great grandfather Robert, when he got to come back home. So
Okay. So you have one of his letters here ready to go. So can you give us the context here for what he's about to tell us about in this?
yes. So this was on October 28th. So this was shortly after coming off the lines of what we just talked about, of the big, about 3-week push from that.
Yep.
They are back in, I think they're actually in Le Mans, France.
Okay.
If they're not, if he's not there in this one, he shortly goes to Le Mans. That's where he stays basically until he comes back home.
Oh,
But
okay.
he's just back somewhere on the back lines right now when he's writing this. So, like you're saying, that context of he's just been fighting for a little over 3 weeks, and it's, I'm sure there's a lot of talk of the war's close to being over. It's probably going to be over any day now.
Right.
It's getting there. We're really putting a whooping on them. So that's probably in the back of his mind a lot. But down in the letter a little bit further, you'll kind of hear a little bit of a. He sort of talks about that just a little bit and addresses it. But so yeah, he's just come off the lines, and he'll say that here in the first paragraph or so to let you know. But so this is on October 28th, and it starts off. He would always put at least the area where he was when he would
Okay.
address it. Nothing, everything had to make it past the censor.
Yep.
So, but all he wrote on this was "Beautifulest days in France, October 28th, 1918. Miss Arna Carwile, Hillham, Tennessee, USA." So he starts, "My dearest dear, it's with the greatest of pleasures that I now write you a few lines to tell you that Jerry has not killed me yet. Also to let you know that I haven't heard from you for some time and that I'm getting anxious to hear from you. I've been up to the front for several days and haven't had time to write much, but believe me, I've had some real sport chasing the Huns. We chased them for several days, captured lots of them, and you can guess what we done with the balance." Which, a little aside, real quick, he does write how he talks. So if I sound extra country when I'm reading this, it's because I'm reading I'm reading his writing.
No
So
way, man. I love it. I love it. This is like authentic. This is great.
yeah, and that's the reason I picked this letter. It's packed with a lot of stuff that kind of is very indicative of just his time. So and you can guess what we've done with the balance. We were out in the open and had no trenches, so it reminded me of hunting rabbit. Only we had to be on our job to keep Jerry from coming up on us and to keep out of his shell fire. It's really funny to be in battle, except you have to fall in so many shell holes to get cover. I think that God was with me, or I'm the luckiest kid Dad's got, or I could not have went where I did. The Huns are daring devils, but the Yanks has them skinned a city block. Whenever we have a task to do, we all start the wheel rolling, and in a short time it's all finished and we are all jolly again. The best of all is we captured his artillery guns, and the Australians feeds them with their own spoon. Well, I guess I had better ask how you are enjoying yourself these days. Hope you are having some big times. I'm all okay myself, only as I have told you so often, just as lonesome as can be. But that's not bad at all, is it? Arna, I wish I could see you today. I'm sure I could tell you lots that I won't think of to write. But listen, I believe that we will all be home before so very much longer, or I hope. And trust me that we will anyway. I were at a meeting yesterday and we had a very good service. Do you all still have big meetings at Allen's Chapel? Say, I'm going to send you some pictures of some Germans we captured if my captain will allow me to do so, and I believe he will. Now, I would hate for any of the boys back there, to have to come over here. Still, I would be glad to see them. I am like yourself. I don't think Calvin will ever have to come unless he gets his top story furnished. And I don't think there is any chance for that now, as I believe he has waited too long. Don't you? Another aside. So Calvin, as we understand it, was one of her, I think, relatives that was slightly mentally handicapped in some way, and that's why he
Okay.
said his top story wasn't furnished. And
Oh,
that's why he's saying he probably won't come over because of that. But
okay.
so, and he says a couple of other names, but they're just names of people that they know. But I just wanted to throw that in there so people weren't
Sure.
like, he had to do his furniture in his house before he could
I,
come over or
I
something.
was
So
thinking something completely different. Yeah.
yeah,
Thank
so
you for that.
I just wanted to clear that up a little bit. Okay, so let's see. Arna, I'm so very sorry that I bothered you writing so much. Or I'm so very sorry that I bothered you so much by writing you so often. I'll try not to do so anymore, if you will pardon me this time. Guess you've been reading the papers and know more about the war than I can tell you. Still, I know some things myself, but there has never been a battle so bad. But what I can think of you, and wonder if you are still praying for a Yank in France. Arna, I can't help but believe your prayers has helped me in going over the top. I also believe that Jesus was with me too. I know that I do things yet that I ought not to do, but I'm not ashamed to ask God to forgive my sins when I bow down at night. I hope you Christians back home will continue to pray for us soldiers in France. Arna, you tell Avery that I haven't ever got any letter from her yet, but that I keep looking for one every day. You spoke about Ann Ferguson getting married. She sure was lucky, wasn't she? I guess most of the girls will marry before I get to come back, but that will all be right. Just so as there's one left for me, and you already know who that one is, don't you, Arna? Say, tell Cannon I say for him to come over and help me kill and capture Germans. It's real sport. Well, I hope you pardon this paper, or rather, pardon me. It's the best I have at present. Excuse my bad handwriting and misspellings, and I'll bring my letter to a close. May God bless you and ever be with you is my prayer. Answer soon and a long letter. Yours ever, Lee. So that was his, and that's probably one of my favorite letters of his, because a lot of his other ones he doesn't really go into much detail. He just
Hmm.
kind of talks about how lonesome he is, and he's basically just trying to keep himself at the top of her mind. So
Right.
when he
Sure.
comes back, that he wants to get married, and they did, of course. The other reason I like this letter is in a lot of his other ones in the beginning, he doesn't really use much British jargon or slang or anything.
Can hear that in there.
But in this one, especially when he talks about we get the ball rolling, and then when it's all finished, we're all jolly again. Like I think he says jolly in one other letter, one of these other later letters, but he never uses it. And I think it's just a neat way to see, being in close proximity with those guys and picking up some of their lingo, kind of
Yeah.
like when you're away on a trip or you're with a friend from another area that might have certain catchphrases or slang that they use, and you kind of pick up on it. I just think that's really interesting. But then also just how he refers to the Germans as Jerry and the Huns, and especially when he says the Huns are daring devils. It's just really neat to hear that come through in the letter. And
Also, mentions of sport, right? Like we don't.
yes,
That's
you
a
wouldn't
very
think.
British thing. That's cool.
Yeah, it's a very, very British way to say it, and it's also just I know it's a way for them to cope, and looking at it through a 21st century lens of
Mhm.
PTSD and all that kind of stuff. It's just the way that they kind of coped with it, where it was like, it is what it is. In one of his other letters, I think it's the one before this one, he talks about it's actually pretty fun going, or we have a lot of fun over here, but right before we go over the top, it's not as fun. So he talks about having this kind of weird juxtaposition of, like soldiers do anywhere really, of, like, we got downtime, we got to kill time, make fun, have our own fun. But then when it gets down to business, it's like, oh yeah, that's what we're here for. This, you kind of
Yeah.
straighten up sort of and kind of get ready for it. So, but yeah, that's one of his most interesting letters, I think.
Wow. What a cool snapshot in time. And for you to bring it in, it's a connection to you. It's your great grandfather. And of course, like thank God he made it back. So we're here talking because of that. Like
Yep.
the follow on effects. So wow, that's just so awesome, and to hear it like written at the how it was at the time, and even
Yeah.
as you said, like he's writing the way he speaks. So
hmm
you also get to hear the back home and the other lingo that he's picking up. So wow, what fantastic! And you said 27 letters that you guys have.
It's something around that, and then we also have. You saw a small selection of the postcards
Mm-hmm.
that he has when he was over. Which that was, I know it was kind of a thing that a lot of soldiers and people did at the time, especially soldiers over there. They would do the postcard pictures, and
Mm-hmm.
he got a bunch of them. He's got a bunch from when he was in Le Mans, and there's one of them I think I showed you. I can't remember, but it's a picture of Le Mans, and he has a line and an X on it, and from the X he has the line drawn out, and it says, "Here where I stayed." So
Yes.
actually shows the place where he was billeted and stayed. Um, and I also showed you the picture. I don't know if this is going video wise or just
Yes.
audio, but
Yes. We definitely will.
um, I'll show you the picture. One of my favorite pictures of him. I don't know how well it'll show up on camera, but I don't know why it's blurring it. It's not bad. There we
Oh,
go.
I'm seeing it. Yep.
Yeah. So this is actually him here on the
Okay.
far left, and I know you can't really see much; it's not zoomed in,
Mm-hmm.
but it's just really interesting to see. They're in full kit.
Mm-hmm.
He's got his full backpacking kit ready to go. It's really good shots of the SMLEs that they carry. Um, but it's of course you can't see it in here, but he's actually got a big cigar that he's got in the side of his mouth,
That's awesome.
which was something that he did while he was over there. Um, but yeah, and if it's something that you would want to do somewhere on your Facebook or whatever, if you wanted me to send you a couple of the scans of these pictures and letters,
Yeah,
if you wanted
please.
to like show them, I think if anyone would want to see them or try and read over them,
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
because he's got beautiful handwriting. It's some of the prettiest. I wish I've got chicken scratch compared to compared to what he has. But yeah, I'd be happy to share those, and if
Perfect. Yeah, please.
eventually.
Yeah, that would be great. That'd be awesome. David, wow, man, this has been really really cool, and what a great way to finish this with hearing the words of your great grandfather. So I just want to thank you so much for taking time out of your evening. I know you're a busy person just like the rest of us, so I really appreciate it. Thanks for coming on and sharing this information and your family's history with us and everybody else who listens to the podcast, man. I really, really appreciate it.
Yeah, not a problem. Thank you for letting me come on and do this. It's something I've wanted to do for a while, is either do some sort of podcast of just his letters and the
Hmm.
history, like surrounding the context of each letter, or just getting these out so people can see them, because I know just letters like this and postcards like this don't exist out in the wild very much. So
Right.
I'm just happy that you were able to let me share them with everybody and share a little piece of it. And I really appreciate it. I've had a great fun tonight.
Oh, awesome. Awesome. All right, man. Well, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.